Imagine you get a phone call from someone who just wronged you. They sound genuinely sorry. They say, "That was a mistake, I shouldn't have done it, let's keep talking, let's find a way through this." You hang up the phone feeling, for the first time in a while, like there might actually be a path forward. And less than a day later, before you've even had breakfast, that same person changes every lock on every door you share, boards up the windows, and slides a note under the door saying nobody gets in or out of this house until you personally leave the neighborhood. Which version of that person do you believe? The one on the phone or the one at the door? That is almost exactly the situation Washington woke up to this weekend with Iran. And I think the honest answer to that question, the one almost nobody is asking directly, is that you may be dealing with two different people entirely, operating out of the same house, and that distinction matters enormously for what happens next. Let's lay out exactly what happened in order, because the sequence here is the whole story. On July 7th, two tankers transiting the Strait of Hormuz were struck by projectiles. One was a Qatari-owned liquefied natural gas carrier called the Al Raqayyat, which suffered an engine room fire serious enough that its crew had to be evacuated over fears the ship might explode. The other was a Saudi-flagged supertanker called the Wedyan. Qatar publicly accused Iran of being behind the attack on its vessel. Iranian state media, notably, didn't deny it, and in some accounts appeared to half confirm it, even though no Iranian official made a formal claim of responsibility. Less than 24 hours after that, the IRGC struck a third vessel in the strait. The American response came fast and came hard. The Treasury Department reimposed sanctions on Iranian oil exports that had only recently been lifted as part of the Islamabad Memorandum, the agreement that was supposed to be winding this war down. And CENTCOM launched a fresh wave of strikes, hitting somewhere between 80 and 90 Iranian military targets clustered around the strait, specifically aimed at degrading Iran's capacity to keep threatening commercial shipping there. Iran retaliated in kind and across a startling number of locations almost simultaneously. A communications and radar facility in Bahrain, the American Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, refueling platforms used by U.S. aircraft carriers at the port of Duqm in Oman, and a strike on a CENTCOM command facility in Jordan. Iran's own health ministry later confirmed 17 people killed and 115 injured inside Iran from the American strikes that week. This was not a symbolic skirmish. This was, by any reasonable definition, a resumption of open warfare across 5 countries in the span of about 72 hours. And then something interesting happened, something that almost got lost in the noise of everything else. In the days immediately following that exchange, reporting emerged that Iranian officials had privately told American counterparts that the initial attacks on the tankers had been a mistake, essentially a misstep, and that Tehran wanted to keep the diplomatic channel open rather than let the whole framework collapse. President Trump, for his part, was simultaneously telling the public the ceasefire was, in his word, over, while also confirming that talks between the two sides would continue regardless. A senior Iranian source told Reuters that Iran, the United States, Qatar, and Pakistan had actually agreed in principle to hold a call over the weekend to try to get negotiations back on track. Qatari negotiators were reported traveling to Tehran specifically to help ease the situation. Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, met his Omani counterpart in Muscat to discuss, among other things, maritime security in the strait. On paper, by Saturday, you had every visible sign of a de-escalation track actively underway. Contrition on one side. Continued willingness to talk on both. Multiple mediators shuttling between capitals. This is what diplomatic recovery from a crisis is supposed to look like in its early stages. And then, in the early hours of Sunday, July 12th, the IRGC Navy issued a statement that blew all of that up, not metaphorically. The statement announced that the Strait of Hormuz was now closed, in its words, until further notice, and would remain closed until the United States ends what it called its intervention in the region. No vessel, the statement said, will be permitted to transit the strait, and crucially, this wasn't framed as a continuation of the July 7th incident that Iran had reportedly just apologized for. The IRGC cited a completely separate, fresh trigger. According to their account, a vessel had switched off its tracking systems and attempted to move through the strait along what Iran considers an unauthorized route, ignoring repeated warnings to correct course, and Iranian forces fired on it and brought it to a halt. Following that specific incident, the IRGC said the strait would be shut entirely, and any military action taken in response, framed by the IRGC as retaliation using this closure as a pretext, would be met with what they called a forceful response, one that would extend to additional enemy bases across the region. So, walk through the actual timeline with me one more time, because the contradiction here isn't subtle once you line it up. Iranian diplomats speaking through back channels to American officials and mediators were saying, in effect, "We made a mistake, let's keep talking," in the days right after the July 7th tanker strikes. Iranian foreign ministry officials were actively meeting with Omani counterparts about maritime security cooperation. And then, within roughly a day of that conciliatory posture becoming public knowledge, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Navy, a completely different institution operating under its own command structure, unilaterally declared the entire strait closed over an unrelated incident, using language explicitly warning that any American or allied response would trigger further strikes on regional bases. That is not one government sending one message that later escalated in response to new provocation. That is two arms of the same state producing two incompatible messages within about 24 hours of each other on the single most consequential piece of maritime geography in the global economy. I think this is where a specific concept from political science actually earns its keep, rather than being decoration. It's called the principal agent problem, and it describes what happens when an organization's nominal leadership, the principal, and the various institutions meant to carry out that leadership's will, the agents, develop diverging interests, diverging information, or diverging incentives, to the point where the agents start acting in ways the principal either didn't authorize or can't fully control. This is not a uniquely Iranian phenomenon. Every government on Earth deals with some version of it, but Iran's version of this problem has a particularly stark institutional shape because the IRGC is not simply a branch of Iran's conventional armed forces. It was established as a constitutionally distinct organization, answerable directly to the supreme leader rather than routed through the same civilian chain of command that oversees Iran's foreign ministry and its regular military. The IRGC runs its own navy, controls vast segments of Iran's economy, and has historically operated with a level of institutional autonomy that lets it take military action, particularly in exactly this kind of maritime asymmetric context, without necessarily waiting for sign-off from the diplomats who are, at the very same moment, sitting across a table from Omani and Qatari mediators trying to keep the peace process alive. Now, I want to be careful here because there are genuinely two different explanations for what we just watched, and I don't think we can fully rule either one out yet. The first explanation is exactly the principal agent story I just laid out, a genuine coordination failure, where Iran's foreign ministry is negotiating in good faith and the IRGC operating with real autonomy and possibly with different priorities entirely, unilaterally escalated in a way that undercuts its own government's diplomatic position. If that's what happened, it should worry Washington more than a deliberate, coordinated Iranian strategy would, for the same reason I raised in the context of the Khamenei funeral story. A government you can negotiate with, even a hostile one, requires a single authority capable of making and enforcing commitments. A government where the diplomats and the Navy are visibly not on the same page is a government where any agreement reached at the table may not survive contact with whichever faction feels like enforcing its own version of the rules that same week. The second explanation is less generous to Iran, and it's the one I suspect a lot of people in Washington will gravitate toward instinctively. It's the idea that this is not a coordination failure at all, but a deliberate good cop, bad cop strategy, one that Iran has arguably used at various points throughout this entire war. The diplomats stay reasonable, apologetic, and available, which keeps the door to sanctions relief and de-escalation technically open and keeps international mediators like Oman and Qatar invested in continuing to broker a deal. Meanwhile, the IRGC does whatever it judges necessary to maintain actual operational control over the strait, regardless of what the diplomatic track promises. Because for the IRGC specifically, sovereign control over that waterway is not a bargaining chip to be traded away. It's closer to a core institutional interest they've been building toward for years. Remember, this isn't the IRGC's first attempt to redefine the terms of passage through the strait. Back in May, the IRGC Navy had already announced that it was reclassifying the entire strait as what it called a vast operational area, extending its claimed zone of control from the Iranian port of Jask all the way to Siri Island, a much larger area than the narrow international shipping channel that the rest of the world has always treated as the actual strait. If you read this weekend's closure through that lens, it's not really a reaction to one rogue vessel. It's another data point in a months-long deliberate campaign by the IRGC specifically to establish itself, rather than international maritime law, rather than the US Navy, rather than even Iran's own foreign ministry, as the actual authority over who moves through Hormuz and under what terms. I want to flag one more piece of this story that I think deserves attention precisely because it's uncertain, not despite that. There have been scattered, unconfirmed reports suggesting that Iran may have actually lost precise track of some of the naval mines it planted in the strait earlier in the war, and that this may be part of why Iran has been unable or unwilling to fully reopen the waterway even when it has had diplomatic incentive to do so. I want to stress that this claim is not solidly verified, and I'm not presenting it to you as established fact. But I raise it because if there's any truth to it at all, it complicates both of the explanations I just gave you. It would mean that at least part of what looks like deliberate escalatory signaling from the IRGC might actually be a genuine operational constraint, a military force that created a hazard it can no longer fully account for or safely dismantle, layered on top of whatever political calculations are also happening. In other words, even the parties inside Iran who might genuinely want to fully reopen the strait right now may not have a clean, safe way to do it, regardless of what any diplomat promises a mediator in Muscat. Let's talk about what's actually at stake economically here, because I think the scale of this gets lost when the story becomes just another item in a long list of tit-for-tat strikes. Before this war began, something close to a fifth of the entire world's oil supply moved through the Strait of Hormuz. When the IRGC first closed the strait back in March, Brent crude spiked to around $114 a barrel, the single largest monthly increase in oil prices ever recorded up to that point. And here's the detail I think is genuinely underappreciated in most of the commentary around this war. An analysis comparing oil and fuel shipments in the months after the war began against the same period a year earlier found that the two biggest financial beneficiaries of the entire disruption were not, as you might expect, oil-rich Gulf producers finding some clever workaround. They were the United States, which saw export revenues rise by an estimated $50 billion, and Russia, whose exports held steady while its revenues rose by more than $15 billion. Meanwhile, every Gulf oil exporter without an alternative route around the strait saw its own exports decline, with only Saudi Arabia, which has pipeline capacity to the Red Sea, and Oman, which benefits simply from its geography, managing to avoid the worst of the bottleneck. Sit with that for a second. The choke point crisis that is currently being fought over almost entirely between Iran, the United States, and their respective regional proxies has, as one of its clearest measurable outcomes so far, quietly transferred tens of billions of dollars in oil revenue toward Washington and Moscow, two capitals that are not exactly the two parties negotiating in Muscat this weekend. Now let's bring this back to the American side of the ledger, because I don't want you to walk away thinking this contradiction problem belongs only to Tehran. The United States has its own version of exactly this same public messaging whiplash. Trump has spent the past week simultaneously declaring the ceasefire dead and confirming that talks with Iran are ongoing, two positions that sit in roughly the same kind of tension as Iran's own contradictory signals. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, commenting on the strikes that hit Iran this past week, put it about as bluntly as an American cabinet official can put something like this in public, saying simply that Iran made a poor choice, and now they pay. That's the language of a government settling in for punishment, not the language of a government trying to preserve a fragile diplomatic opening. And yet, at the very same moment, senior American officials were reportedly pressing Iranian negotiators through Omani channels to make a specific, narrow request that Iran simply state publicly that the strait is open, that ships can pass without tolls, and that attacks on shipping will stop. That is not the ask of a government that has genuinely written off diplomacy. That's the ask of a government trying to lock in exactly the kind of face-saving, minimal declaration that would let both sides step back from the brink without either one having to admit defeat. So if you're looking for a single, unified, coherent American strategy this weekend, you're not going to find one either. You're going to find the same pattern on both sides of this negotiating table: public toughness, private flexibility, and enough daylight between the two that neither side's actual intentions are fully legible to the other, or frankly, to us. There is one structural idea already on the table that I think is worth mentioning here, because it points toward what an actual resolution might look like if anyone gets serious about implementing it rather than just floating it. Oman has reportedly proposed a two-corridor arrangement for the strait. Under this plan, a southern corridor running through Omani territorial waters would allow free navigation with no Iranian approval required at all. A separate northern corridor running through Iranian waters would require ships to get prior approval from Iran, though notably without any toll being charged. This is, in effect, a formalized version of exactly the kind of two-tier system that shipping analysts were already describing informally months ago. One lane where Iran calls the shots, one lane where it doesn't, running in parallel through the same strategic waterway. Whether that kind of structural compromise can actually hold, given that we just watched the IRGC unilaterally shut the entire strait days after its own foreign ministry was reportedly discussing exactly this kind of maritime security cooperation with Oman, is the real test that's coming. A negotiated framework is only as durable as the institution enforcing it, and right now it's genuinely unclear which Iranian institution that would even be. It's also worth stepping back and noticing that this isn't even the first time this exact cycle has played out this year, which should temper anyone's instinct to treat Sunday's closure as some unprecedented rupture, rather than the latest lap of a pattern we've already seen several times. Back in late March, the IRGC closed the strait once before, after negotiations failed to produce a ceasefire, and that closure was what sent oil prices to their record monthly spike. In April, after talks in Islamabad broke down, Trump himself announced a naval blockade of Iranian vessels and ports, continuing to restrict traffic even while separately declaring a ceasefire was in effect, which is its own small monument to the same kind of contradictory signaling we're used to seeing from Tehran. By mid-April, Iran had introduced its own supervisory management zone requiring vessels to coordinate transits with Iranian authorities. By May, that had hardened into the vast operational area redefinition I mentioned a moment ago, and by June, following the Islamabad memorandum, Iran's foreign minister was declaring the strait fully open to all traffic, a declaration that itself came with the caveat that it would only hold for the duration of a separate, unrelated ceasefire in Lebanon. One respected analyst covering the region put it simply this week: the reason both sides keep resuming hostilities is that neither one currently views the other as what he called a reliable negotiating partner. If you zoom out across this entire year, you don't see a single strait that got closed once in a moment of crisis. You see a strait that has been opened, closed, redefined, blockaded, and reopened on a rolling basis roughly every few weeks, each time with its own specific triggering incident and its own specific diplomatic caveat, and each time with almost nobody bothering to ask why an arrangement that keeps collapsing on this exact rhythm is still being described in the press as a ceasefire at all. So here's where I think this actually leaves us, and I want to be honest that I don't think there's a clean, confident answer available yet. What we watched this weekend was not simply an escalation, it was a demonstration in real time of exactly how fragmented the decision-making on at least one side of this conflict may currently be. Either Iran's foreign ministry is negotiating in good faith while its own navy operates on a separate track entirely, which should make anyone in Washington deeply skeptical of how durable any agreement reached at that negotiating table will actually be. Or this is a deliberate strategy, using diplomatic contrition as cover, while the IRGC continues to consolidate the kind of unilateral control over Hormuz it has been building toward since at least May, in which case the diplomatic track itself is closer to theater than to substance. Both explanations point toward the same practical conclusion for anyone trying to actually resolve this crisis. You cannot negotiate a lasting arrangement over the world's most important oil choke point with a government whose own public statements contradict each other inside a single news cycle. And until someone can tell you definitively which Iranian institution actually has the final word here, every apology, every ceasefire announcement, and every closure declaration coming out of Tehran deserves to be read as provisional, contested, and quite possibly overruled by morning. Watch what happens with the Omani mediation this week. Watch whether Iran's foreign ministry publicly contradicts or endorses the IRGC's closure statement. And watch, above all, whether the multi-billion-dollar windfall quietly flowing to Washington and Moscow gives either of those capitals any real incentive to want this crisis resolved quickly at all. I'll be back to walk you through it as it develops.